Guys, after subscribing to this channel, please make sure that you also press the bell icon so that no notification, no new video of mine, any educational video is missed by anybody.
Let's start with the female pelvis, and we'll talk about the female pelvis into three parts: the female pelvis in the pelvic inlet, the cavity, and the outlet. Okay, so we'll first talk about the female pelvis into two parts. Of course, you know that false pelvis and true pelvis. As far as false pelvis is concerned, it's of no obstetrical significance. That is because the false pelvis is bounded, and in fact, what exactly is false pelvis is any pelvis which is above the above the starting of the pelvic inlet is actually the false pelvis. So that means it is bounded posteriorly by the lumbar vertebra, on the either sides by iliac fossa, and anteriorly by the anterior abdominal wall. The only significance of false pelvis is that it accommodates the growing uterus and it gives support to the growing uterus. The tone of the anterior abdominal muscle becomes very important in supporting the false pelvis. Otherwise, it's got no bony support system. So finally, what comes is the true pelvis. Now, true pelvis is the one which actually starts with the pelvic inlet. And what is exactly pelvic inlet made of? Now, listen very closely and remember one very important funda of answering in practicals. You have to be very confident and fast. The moment you fumble, the moment you go slow, the examiner has time to stop you and ask you questions. So just finish off whatever you are saying fast. Do not give them time to stop you at something. Usually you fumble at things you're not very, you're weak on. So do not let them catch your weak point. That's the funda. Anyway, so pelvic inlet is bounded by these boundaries. It starts from pubic symphysis, pubic crest, pubic tubercle, the pectineal line, iliopectineal eminence, iliopectineal line, the sacroiliac joint, the ala of the sacrum, and then the sacral promontory, and the same on the other side as well. This is what forms the pelvic inlet. Now, the pelvic inlet is when the widest diameter of the fetal skull, when it crosses the pelvic inlet, we call it the engagement. That means the largest transverse diameter, which we say is biparietal diameter, when it crosses the the pelvic inlet, it is thought to be, that's called as engagement. That is one important obstetrical significance of pelvic inlet. And of course, pelvic inlet, where like I spoke in my last lecture, where exactly is the denominator related to the pelvic inlet is what we call as position. That position which is very important in deciding the course of labor and the action to be taken during the course of labor. So if it is left occipito-anterior, it is the most favored position. We know that the labor should be without much complications. The second most important and most common is right occipito-anterior. The third is right occipito-posterior, and the least common is the left occipito-posterior position. But any occipito-posterior position can create problems, as I will be discussing later on when I discuss occipito-posterior position. So this was about the pelvic inlet. Now we'll talk about the diameters of pelvic inlet. Let's now talk about the important diameters of the pelvic inlet, which are very important, three diameters actually, but of course they are split into different parts now, and I'll tell you on the way. So first of all, when I'm talking about inlet, cavity, exit, whatever, you have to talk about basically the anterior-posterior diameter, the oblique diameters, and the transverse diameter. Okay, so when I'm talking about the anterior-posterior diameter over here, you don't have one, you have three. So this to this, basically, that means roughly from the pubic symphysis to the sacral promontory becomes your anteroposterior diameter. Okay. Now this anteroposterior diameter is actually divided into three: the true conjugate, the obstetrical conjugate, and the diagonal conjugate. So I'll describe to you later on about the importance and why do we call it, why have we split it into three conjugates. But the anteroposterior diameter is basically divided into three parts. Basically, it starts from the pubic symphysis to the midpoint on the sacral promontory. Now, anything from the upper portion of the pubic symphysis to the midpoint of sacral promontory is true conjugate. Middle, or the a little protrusion is there at the back side of the pubic symphysis, that that tubercle thing, or the midpoint of the pubic symphysis posteriorly to the midpoint of sacral promontory is called the obstetrical conjugate, because since it is a little elevated portion, so it kind of further deranges the anteroposterior diameter. Then comes the most important, diagonal conjugate, which we get to measure. Diagonal conjugate is the lower portion, lowermost part of the pubic symphysis to the midpoint of sacral promontory. That is your diagonal conjugate. And then comes the transverse diameter, that means this diameter. So this is between the two iliopectineal lines. That's called the transverse diameter of the pelvic inlet. And then comes the the diagonal conjugate, the diagonal diameter. The diagonal or the oblique diameter is actually from the sacroiliac joint to the pectineal line, or the pubic tubercle on the other side. Now this diagonal or the oblique diameter is actually of no use, but you should know the values of these first. So let's first talk about the values. So anteroposterior diameter, like I told you, first of all comes the true conjugate, then comes the obstetrical conjugate, and then comes the diagonal conjugate, and the measurements happen to be 10 to 10.5, 11 to 11.5, and 12 to 12.5. The transverse diameter, the measurement of the transverse diameter is around 13 centimeters, and that of your diagonal diameter or the oblique diameter is around 12 centimeters. Mostly all, to be what do I say, a little tip from me, mostly all the oblique diameters that you'll be dealing with will have around 12 centimeters as the measurement. So do not confuse, do not forget. Now the importance of diagonal conjugate, why is it's very important, because that's the only diameter you get to measure by your hand. And it's important because in early labor, or when you are in late pregnancy or in early labor, you need to measure if the pelvis is adequate or not. You've been taught this in your postgraduate training. So how do you know that the pelvis is adequate or not? So you take basically your gloved finger, your right hand, and you try to, obviously this is how you put your hand. So what happens is you trace this, the sacral promontory. It's said that when it starts to recede, when this bony prominence, it starts to recede, first of all you'll deal with this part, the most prominent sacral promontory, and then you go a little above. So once it starts to recede, that is the point of you're taking your diagonal conjugate. And if it's not able to feel, if your hand is not able to feel the sacral promontory, then we roughly consider the pelvis as adequate. Otherwise, the distance from whichever point the pubic symphysis was touching your hand till the point of your gloved finger, wherever you marked it. How will you mark? That's also a question. What they've said in the books is that with the left hand you mark it on your gloved finger wherever your point touches or it doesn't touch the sacral promontory. That distance should be the diagonal conjugate. But it's actually not like that in reality. When you actually do the pervaginal examination in a patient who's already in early labor or late pregnancy, if the sacral promontory cannot be touched with your gloved finger, if it's receding away and you cannot reach it, that means the pelvis is roughly adequate. So that was the importance of pelvic inlet. Now let's take up the pelvic cavity.